Welcome to Season 3 of the SoundStage Audiophile Podcast. Last year, host Jorden Guth got a crash course in the fundamentals of hi-fi from enthusiasts, journalists, manufacturers, and music industry professionals alike. Those lessons will continue, but this year, Jorden will also get a history lesson from the legends who were there from the giddy-up and who made hi-fi what it is today. So with that out of the way, here's Jorden and this week's guest.
Hello and welcome to the SoundStage Audiophile Podcast. Today, Peter Lyngdorf is joining us. And Peter is the founder, co-founder, owner, distributor, and a whole lot of other things for basically too many brands in hi-fi that I can name. So I know there's HiFi Klubben, there's DALI, we got Lyngdorf Audio. Can you name off a couple more for me, Peter?
Under Lyngdorf Audio, we also have Steinway Lyngdorf, the collaboration with Steinway and Sons.
Of course.
And then recently, over the last few years, I founded also Argon Audio, which is only known in Europe so far, but it's growing very fast. We're making very affordable products under that name. And we just recently done a company called Radiance, which is making speakers primarily with the drivers from Purify, which is a company I co-founded close to 10 years ago. And we have a new company called Vestlyd, which makes high-efficiency coaxial speakers. And that's just about it. And then, of course, I've been owner of quite a few companies over the years.
Yeah, we got NAD in there, Snell, Griffin,
Snell Acoustics, Griffin Audio, and is there more? There's probably one or two more. I don't remember.
That's all good. That's a hard quiz with the amount that you do, so you definitely keep busy. Thank you for joining us, and welcome.
Thank you. My pleasure.
So this interview is an interesting one in that when we actually recorded a video interview with you, the SoundStage Icons, well over a year ago. And we released it a couple months ago, or not even a couple months ago, a few weeks ago, I'll say that. Yeah. And the reception of it was really good. And I watched it again, and I started thinking of all these other questions that I would love to have asked you at the time, that Doug was kind of going back and forth with you. And you were gracious enough to say, yes, you'd come on the SoundStage Audiophile Podcast. So I really appreciate it. And I guess I kind of want to follow up to that to some degree and just kind of see where the conversation leads, if that's okay.
Yeah. Great. Yep.
All right. So to get started, asking you what your first memory of hi-fi, what you mentioned to Doug in the SoundStage Icons video was this idea that you were listening to the radio and you heard the Beatles, and that inspired you for the first time. I guess my kind of question there is, do you remember the first time you heard good audio? Because you kind of mentioned that was maybe not the best quality. Was there an instance where you heard like a speaker system that you're like, not only is the music awesome, but now the speakers are cool?
Well, that is a very good question, because when I heard the Beatles the first time, I was lying under my dad's radio, which was like a furniture type radio without any box speaker, but it was just open to the back and so on. I always enjoyed listening from below that radio turntable complete system, because that was where the bass was heaviest, if there was any bass. When did I hear the first? One of my friends was a little bit spoiled kid, and his parents bought him some JBL speakers.
Oh,
that was the first kind of expensive speakers I heard, and I loved the sound, and that inspired me really to go to London and listen to the louder horn speakers. And I loved those speakers for quite a while, and I was building kits with those speaker drivers. And so the first was probably the JBL speakers.
Oh, that's interesting. I wouldn't have guessed. I would have expected like a European brand, but JBL's a good one. That's awesome.
Yeah, they were good. And then, of course, at that time, the regular brands was like Peerless was making complete speakers. Also, Bang & Olufsen made speakers.
Yeah.
It was sounding pretty good and so on. But I didn't think so much about sound quality in the beginning. I thought more about the loudness.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So the first speakers I bought was with two 12-inch full-range Peerless woofers or Peerless speakers in a big box. I was putting them on the wall on hinges so that I could angle them towards me and so on. So that I had a tiny little room and 4 12-inch full-range drivers.
You could make everything shake if you
Absolutely.
wanted to.
I could make the speakers fold up to the wall by playing loud because they were on hinges. They were hinged on the wall, so I could turn them and so on.
And when you started kind of getting into hi-fi a little bit more, did you immediately start thinking of like wanting to kind of not devote your life to hi-fi, which it seems like you have to some degree devoted your life to hi-fi, but did you kind of get a sense that you wanted to have hi-fi or music be that large of a part of your life? Or did you kind of fall into it? Like
I fell into it, and I started, my first product was a Tandberg tape recorder, because that allowed me to record the Beatles songs from the radio. Of course, sticking a microphone up in front of the radio, this would have been awful quality. But anyway, that was my first hi-fi product. And for that, I built a couple of kit speakers with Peerless drivers and a Peerless crossover and so on. So I built the box myself. That was cheaper than to buy finished speakers. And then I was playing around with loudspeakers all the time when I went to high school. I didn't do much else than playing with loudspeakers. I just recently was cleaning up my bookshelves, and I found my grade, what do you call it, report back to the parents from the school.
Yeah, the report cards.
And the headmaster had written the note that very dryly that with this amount of free time from the school, it doesn't make much sense that Peter continues in school. Within 90 days, I had 21 full days where I didn't meet for school, and another like 76 single hours where I didn't attend. So I was awful because I was playing around with speakers.
With that, have you met, or in the past, have you run into any of either the teachers or maybe your fellow classmates that you went to school with, and they kind of knew you then and saw kind of, I don't know, maybe when you're at a stage of HiFi Klubben or whatever it may be?
Yeah, I met quite a few of them. And of course, once I started HiFi Klubben, that became very famous very quickly. Lots of articles in newspapers and so on about me disrupting the business of other dealers and all of that. So at that time, they got to know me, and I met up with a few of them, and and what my biggest surprise from that was I met my Danish teacher from the school, and I said, I have to apologize for being such an awful student. And she said, oh, no, you were always so sweet. You were sleeping all the time, but you were so sweet. Because in school, I had a full-time job from I was 15, so I could afford some better speakers and hi-fi and so on. And I was sleeping in the school because I had a nighttime job in a hotel as a receptionist, and I finished work at 7:30 in the morning and went straight to school at 8, and then I was sleeping for the first couple of hours.
That's awesome. Yeah, so, I love that story, and I love the idea, because when you meet different people, and especially hi-fi is one area, but this is true for everything, no one takes the same path to get where they're going.
No.
And it's very interesting. There are people that may dedicate their life to hi-fi. They go through university, they do all this, but they never kind of, I'm not going to say accomplish the same things, but they never apply what they've learned potentially to make it into something.
No, and in retrospect, I think I was kind of lucky that I never had time to get a formal education, because I was more or less kicked out of high school with the lowest grades ever in the history of the school. And I couldn't go to university because my grades were so terrible. So I thought, when I started my business, I got a job with marketing for 3 weeks, and then with the shipping for 3 weeks. And then I started my business. And I thought right away, bummer, I don't have any education. I don't know how to do anything. I better do everything very differently. So that was my mode of operations. So all the time, if somebody was doing one thing, I was doing something else, because I thought I can never, ever compete with these clever guys with an education and university degrees and whatever. So it was actually quite good, because I knew I had to do things differently.
So that's kind of a neat perspective on it. Do you think, because even just speaking to you previously and kind of looking at your track record of companies and all that, you always seem to bring up the very clever people that you've met and interacted with and essentially partnered with to like create these businesses. So you think by not going to school, you made kind of more of an effort to establish those connections to kind of bring that out in other people?
Yes, in a way. And I was always very, very humble to anybody who had an education. But also, I soon realized that if you talk to very bright people, they can explain things in a very simple way.
Yeah.
The not so bright people will start to explain things in a more complicated way. So the guys who can explain a thing so that it's easy to understand, they're often the smartest.
I appreciate that sentiment so much. And there's a couple times, I'm relatively new to learning about HiFi, and there's a couple times that I meet some of these engineers, and I ask them a question, and I know it's probably a dumb question. I get it. I don't know these things to know that it's a dumb question. And it's so interesting, the ones that can explain it to me and probably would be able to explain it to my 10-year-old versus getting some of these more technical answers and being like, I still don't understand what you're explaining.
Yeah. But it's funny, I'm over the last many years, I worked a lot about, in acoustics.
Yeah.
Because we were working at Snell Acoustics on the room correction systems. And that taught me a lot about what is important, what is not important in room acoustics, and how to deal with acoustical problems and so on. Whenever I see somebody on the internet, and there are a lot of gurus in room acoustics, it's cringeworthy, because apparently a lot of them, they overdo the engineering part of acoustics. And I would say 95% of the rooms that I have heard that would have been expertly treated for room acoustics sound much worse than before they started to put stuff in it. Because nothing is as horrible as a sound dead room.
For sure.
And so I could recommend for people who, if they ever get an acoustical consultant to help them, don't buy all the stuff from that same consultant, because your room is going to get overstuffed and completely dead at the end of the day.
So we're going to get to room acoustics, because I know there's a lot that you've kind of done and financed, especially to kind of get room acoustics to be significantly better. And there's some great stories in there. I guess going in this timeline a little bit, you started a HiFi Klubben before you started an actual speaker brand.
Yes. I started DALI 3 years after I started HiFi Klubben.
So, and I guess the question that I had was, did you do that kind of in a way to see what the other people were doing and what made them successful? or like, why wouldn't you have started DALI and then started HiFi Klubben?
Oh, that's a good question. In the beginning, I was just selling hi-fi products. I was importing NAD electronics, Serbian Vega loudspeakers, Boston Acoustics, by the way, and a few other brands. So I was just selling to dealers before I started HiFi Klubben.
Yeah.
I started HiFi Klubben because I was fed up with the way they were not serious about the sound and not serious about handling the customers in a good way and so on. So that was really my business. And then I started DALI because I thought, my goodness, we have great opportunities to make speakers in Denmark because we have great furniture factories. We have, at that time, the best driver manufacturing in the world was in Denmark. Then Scanspeak, Viva, Peerless, Dynaudio had started at that time also. So we could buy the very best drivers at quite reasonable prices and so on. And so I found a couple of good engineers. Actually, they had been working in my shop in Copenhagen as salespeople while they got the education at the Technical University in Copenhagen. And they came over to my place and we started to design loudspeakers with them. And then I always thought it was interesting to draw up something and get some ideas about the shape and size and so on. And the first listen, once you design something with some good engineers, is always exciting. You build something that is physical that you can touch.
Yeah.
And then you can listen to it and you can enjoy your music on it. What could be a better way to spend your time? You create something and you use it to play music.
That's so cool. And I didn't really realize that you actually started designing speakers with engineers that were working at HiFi Klubben, and I didn't connect those. So that's interesting. Yeah. You're essentially pulling the best of the university minds right out of university before they went anywhere else.
Well, actually, yes, they were in HiFi Klubben because before they finished their degrees.
Yeah.
They're very good guys. They're still very good friends. They're not working for me anymore, the first few engineers, but they've started their own businesses and so on with something completely else, something completely different. But it always intrigued me, and I loved to do the listening tests, and we were adjusting and so on. At that time, the measurement technology was not as good as it is today. We didn't understand really how to apply the proper measurement techniques. That took a few years, and I think that time nobody really knew how to apply the proper measurement techniques. So there was a lot of listening tests going on before we got sufficiently good products.
And this was roughly the mid to late 80s?
That was 1983 we started DALI.
Okay.
And it became very successful very quickly because HiFi Klubben had already started off in a big way with great sales and so on. And I think, at that time there was a big manufacturers in Denmark were Yarmo and the Dantax. But they were making, in my opinion, not... let's say a wide range of speakers, from very, very cheap to something quite good. But mainly they were in the business of making very, very cheap stuff. So what I wanted to do was to make something that was significantly better at slightly higher price.
Yeah.
And we did that with DALI and it became a huge success.
And when you started DALI and you were still doing HiFi Klubben, and you still do HiFi Klubben to this day, was there any tension between the other manufacturers that you sold at HiFi Klubben, and they're like, what are you doing?
Well, not really, because at that time we had Serbian Vega as our main brand, and that of course was completely different. That was very loud speakers, as they said, and so there was no direct competition. We were selling also B&W.
Oh, no way.
But they're also very different. And even today, we're selling B&W in all of Scandinavia, Germany, Holland, Belgium. No, not in Belgium.
Yeah.
And they are very complementary, they're very different. When you listen to a DALI speaker and the B&W speaker, they're quite different, but they're damn good, both of them.
Yeah. Well, and different aesthetics as well. In even different markets. I can imagine the people that would buy B&W versus DALI might have, I don't know, they just have a different vibe, a different style to it.
Yeah, and yes, and they do sound different, but I like the B&W speakers. I like the DALI speakers a lot also. So, but they're still quite different. And that's the interesting thing about speakers. It's like you can make a few different sounding speakers that are really, really good, but sounding quite different at the same time.
All right. Well, with that, let's take a quick little musical interlude, a little break here. And when we get back, I kind of want to start talking to you a little bit about the room acoustics and then the electronic sides of things. Because not only have you done all of the retail and the speakers, then you got into electronics. So after the break, let's jump into that.
Okay.
Welcome back to the SoundStage Audiophile Podcast. We're still with Peter Lyngdorf, and we just kind of talked a little bit about the earlier years as he got HiFi Klubben up and kind of DALI together, really kind of anchoring himself in the hi-fi space. And Peter, the 90s are really interesting for you because I start seeing you get involved in different electronic companies.
Yeah.
So everything from I think the Millennium amp was a highlight. I remember you kind of walking me through even the dial on that.
Yeah.
But going through, was there any specific technology or kind of philosophy that you were thinking about in those times that had you start up a new company, buy a company, or start investigating technology?
Well, yes, there was quite a few reasons I wanted to go into digital technology primarily. A bit of it was inspired by the people at NAD, and I got to know these guys very, very well. And they had always, for quite a few years, talked about a day when it would be possible to digitally compensate for room acoustics. So I incidentally ended up buying Snell Acoustics because we were the distributor for Snell Acoustics. And then I ran into financial difficulties, and I bought the first half the company and then the whole company. And then Snell Acoustics, I got together with Kevin Bakes, who later went on to work with Harman. And we more or less decided there to try to do a digital room compensation technology. And So Kevin was laying kind of the groundwork, and we were working with a few different digital engineers, and they couldn't really pull it off because at that time DSPs were not fast enough to do what was needed. But we ended up finding a guy called Bosovic, who was really talented in working with DSPs. So we asked him to work on a correction system, so the measurement system and the correction systems and so on. And he was fast and very bright guy. So he figured out a way to make 3 different sample rates within the same DSP so that you could slow down for the low frequencies, speed up a little bit for the mid frequencies, and run full speed for the high frequencies. And that way you could get sufficient resolution at the low frequencies to do an equalization in digital domain. So the first product we brought out actually had a frequency resolution of 0.6 hertz in the bass, which means that it could compensate perfectly down to 15 cycles. There were a couple of earlier tests or trials with, there was a British company and an American company who had done some EQ with DSPs, but their resolution was something like 30 hertz, which means it would work down to about 300 hertz where you start to need it.
Yeah.
So it wasn't really doing anything good. But Bosovic found a way to do the exact correction and also measurement of the response. And that leads me into then all the mistakes we made in the first few years. Because we looked at this measurement we got, and we got a very detailed measurement, and then we compensated. And we created a target curve. You know, that's a common expression nowadays, but I actually came up with the word target curve because it was the first time it had been applied to something like that, that you have a target for the response you want to achieve. And we could actually draw up the target curve, and we could make the frequency response follow that target curve more or less perfectly, except when there were cancellations in the sound. There we couldn't, of course. If you have a cancellation, it is a cancellation. You pump energy into that frequency, it doesn't help. Yeah. It just creates a noise somewhere else in the room. But basically, we could make a correction that looked absolutely fantastic. We came around the problems with overcompensating in the bass by smoothing and averaging and a lot of other tricks that everybody's using nowadays also. Because if you just don't take the raw data and compensate with that, everything goes to hell because you try to compensate for things that are cancellations and so on. But we worked with all of that, and we made something that was working pretty well. And certainly we could achieve a response which was equal to the target curve, plus minus a tiny little bit. The problem was that every time we set up a system, it would sound different. And every time we made it more perfect, it would sound a little bit more annoying. And honestly, when I set up for a hi-fi show, for instance, with the early correction systems, I would first make a measurement and do the correction and so on. And then I would manually adjust everything as good as I could. And I would be spending a few hours to manually adjust everything. And then we would have the first day of the show, and then next evening I would spend 2 or 3 hours to manually adjust everything again. And then on the third day, typically we had a quite good sound. We were selling quite a few of the correction systems. And technically speaking, they should do everything right. It looked good. We got some good reviews. But what was funny was when we made the separate correction systems and the amplifiers with the first room correction system, there was like a small forest of people who started to modify the power supplies of the amplifiers and the power supplies of the preamp and fumbling with cables and so on, because they knew that, oh, now it's perfect because we have exactly the perfect frequency response, but there's something wrong with the sound, so it must be the power supply, or it must be the power cable, or it must be something else. And I knew that all the time there's something we are missing in all of this correction. And then I had the experience at a show in Germany where I was asked to talk about our correction system versus another guy who made a computational analysis of the listening room so that he could find the best possible location of the speaker to get a best possible frequency response. So he had made a computer software where you could calculate the best possible location of the speaker. The software was called Cara, and it was very advanced. It would take a whole night to calculate where you wanted to put your speakers. And the founder of that company, the guy who had done all the mathematics, he was a very, very smart guy, no doubt about it. He could show that he would actually get a good frequency response by his method. And my method at that time was to have boundary speakers, smack on the wall, corner woofers, do a 2+2 system, and then correct for the frequency response problems. So with my system, of course, I had the woofers in the corners, the speakers on the wall are very close to the wall, and we would have almost entirely minimum phase in the beginning of the sound in the room, because the sound could not move the wrong way before it starts to move the correct way towards your listening position. So I was arguing for my system, where I say I don't give a hoot about the frequency response, because we can fix that as long as we don't have a lot of cancellations. So we placed the speakers where they would create the most amount of energy versus the listening position. And then whatever energy was too much, we just reduced with the correction system.
Interesting. Okay.
So in that way, we get a really good time response from the system, because we don't allow the sound to walk the wrong way before it starts to go the right way. Because you have to remember, every speaker is omnidirectional at low frequencies, except for dipoles and some speakers that have sophisticated DSP control and so on. So I was arguing with that professor, he was Professor Doctor, that his approach was interesting and would probably result in a very good frequency response. But then, while I was arguing for my system, which I knew was right, because I could reproduce a kick drum, so it still had the kick, and he couldn't. And I knew intuitively, what he's doing is totally wrong, because just the fact that you're having a good frequency response when you measure it is just a coincidence of the direct sound and all the reflections from the speakers coinciding with the different phase shifts and different arrival times and different response from the direct sound, the rear wall, the side wall, the floor reflections, the ceiling reflection. You end up having a good frequency response. Is a total coincidence of something that happens at different times, different frequency response. It's a whole mess that ends up giving you a good frequency response. So I said, Mr. Tomanek, when you get this fantastic frequency response, I would argue you also get close to the worst possible time response. And then he said something that really triggered me, because he said, But Mr. Lyngdorf, everybody knows that if you have a very flat frequency response, he was German, you also have the best possible time response. And then I said to myself, fuck no, it's exactly the opposite. What we're looking at when we get that good frequency response is a total coincidence that has very little to do with what we hear. And I said to him, yeah, but does it mean with your argument that you have the best possible time response, that all the reflections from the rear of the speaker to the rear wall comes back and is becoming inaudible, or your speaker becomes unidirectional? What is happening to give you that fantastic impulse response? And then he turned around on his heel and walked out of the room and said, obviously, Mr. Lyngdorf hadn't studied acoustics.
And maybe that's a good thing that you didn't study it, because there's a difference between, and I think this is what the essence there, there's a difference between technically perfect and real world enjoyment.
Yes. And what happened after that is I went back to my engineers and I said, forget about everything. We start from scratch. So I hired close to 30 engineers. That was also the time when I got together with Steinway. We hired 30 engineers within a very short time. And the main thing they were asked to work on was a new room correction system. In the meantime, the first engineer, Bosovic, he had screwed me over, so he had left the company. So I had to start a new correction system. I said, we have to start from scratch, because everything we've been doing is wrong. Because, and I'll try to get to the point, when you end up with a good frequency response for a single microphone position, that is a coincidence, or it is the direct response from the speaker. It is a wall reflection, it's a floor reflection, ceiling reflection, and so on, that goes into the microphone and gives you a frequency response. So let's say, just for sake of argument, you have a reflection from the side wall. That comes back to the microphone. So you have the direct sound, you have the reflected sound that comes at a different time. The reflected sound will create a cancellation that to the microphone looks like lack of energy. Mm. So you get a reflection that is canceling something out at 500 hertz. And the microphone says, oh, we have too little energy at 500 hertz.
So it boosts it.
But think about it. You hear the direct sound, and then you hear the reflection at two different times. So you don't hear that 500 hertz is not enough. Right?
Yeah. So it overcompensates and kind of changes it too much to that specific frequency.
It's compensating for something that is totally alien to what you are listening to.
Interesting. Okay.
I can give you another example. That is, if you sit in the perfect stereo position, where you have the perfect stereo imaging, and you listen to a female voice, if you move your head 15 centimeters or 6 inches to the left, the voice tonality sounds exactly the same. There's absolutely no problems with that voice. But if you put a microphone there and measure the frequency response, if you move the microphone 15 centimeters to the left, you have a lot of issues between the two speakers. You have a lot of cancellation. It really sucks.
Yeah.
But it doesn't sound bad.
Interesting.
So when you make a single measurement in a room of a pair of speakers and the room combination, the single measurement gives you, we say it gives you 15% of the information you need to know. It gives you some hints about something. But our method with Room Perfect is to make the money seat measurement. Yes, we make that. But then we make a bunch of random measurements. where the microphone is never very, very close to the speaker and never extremely close to the wall, but you randomly measure different positions in the room. And then there is a very complex system in Room Perfect where all these measurements are compared. And based on all these measurements, we compare all the measurements. We can determine what to ignore and what to correct for.
And with that, would it be fair to say that if you looked at the frequency response after doing Room Perfect, it might not be perfect frequency response, but in terms of the listening, it's going to be a much more natural, better, enjoyable listening experience?
Exactly. We've had issues with reviewers sometimes because then they test Room Perfect and they say, "Oh, it's fantastic, it works wonderfully, it's doing everything right." But then they want to measure with a single measurement in the seating position and say, "Oh, but it's not doing so much. The other systems are filling up all the holes."
Oh, interesting.
But you see, they're filling up all the holes that you should absolutely ignore.
So, and I guess boiling this down, it again, we're going back to this explanation thing. You're explaining it to me in a way that makes a lot of sense. And I know there's a few other kind of room correction or compensation programs out there. Boiling it down for anyone listening, what would be the things that somebody should look for in a room compensation system or technology that is a good indication that they're onto something? Like it'll generally improve it.
Yeah. Now you ask what they should look for. And that's one of the exact issues. Don't look.
Don't look.
Yeah. And, with Room Perfect, we do not allow people to see the measured response for any of the measurements.
Oh.
And we don't allow people to see what it is doing in terms of the correction. Because everybody would say, "Oh, but then we have to fix this, we have to fix that," and so on. But we put that into the algorithms. And as far as I recall, there are about 30 layers of decision-making in Room Perfect to arrive at the best possible compensation for the room. That's another thing. We make a room correction system. It is not a system that is designed to make your B&W speaker sound like a JBL.
Yeah.
So our assumption is that you bought your speaker because you like that speaker. But now, of course, you're stuck with your own listening room, which has problems. So you don't want your B&W speaker to sound like something completely different once you've done correction. So that's our assumption. You can still, with the voicing curves and so on, change the response. If you want it to be a little bit softer, a little bit mellower, a little bit deeper bass, whatever, you can do that manually. But basically, we don't want to change the sound of the speaker because we say it is a room correction system. So that's one of the issues we always say. And if you do a Room Perfect compensation, if you do the A/B between uncorrected and corrected, you would typically say, there's not much difference. It sounds
subtlety is key.
It sounds roughly the same. But what? My room problems? And now I have a nice room for the speaker. My room is really good. But the speaker sounds like my speaker. So the first time I heard Room Perfect versus the old system, I thought, oh, bummer. It doesn't make the same kind of wow difference. And that was because what we did at that time was absolutely right. It was one of the engineers who got a eureka idea about how to do the compensation. And when he explained to me what he wanted to do, the approach he wanted to take, I thought, the guy's bonkers. but he was absolutely right. And I had been spending at that time close to 10 years on listening tests, trial and error and all of that. And all the different smoothing algorithms and everything. So Room Perfect is very different. And I say to reviewers nowadays, if they really want to do a measurement, of course they can do that. But then they can use our EQ in the voicing to try to make it look better. And invariably, once it looks better, it sounds worse.
Again, technically perfect versus real world enjoyment.
Yeah. And the thing is, when you start to think about it, the problem with the normal approach where you show a frequency response and then you have a target curve and so on, is you boil the problem into a problem that would occur inside of an amplifier where there's only one way for the signal coming into the system to the signal coming out of the system. Let's say an amplifier circuitry that needs to be EQ'd, right? But in a room, there's 100,000 different ways the sound comes to the microphone at different times. So you cannot condense it to something that you can just show in a frequency response and with a target curve. It doesn't make sense. It's a totally different thing.
That is fascinating. Now, okay, so Room Perfect, and you've mentioned this before, Room Perfect, you've nailed it. It's perfect. If there's other technologies, and I don't want to take up too much more of your time, and no I know we're getting short on time, but is there other areas or other technologies that you look at now and you say, these are things that we still don't know as much about, that you'd be curious to learn more about, or that you'd like to explore or kind of investigate, that are either not really understood right now, or you think that there's still improvements that can be made in terms of sound?
Oh, of course there are improvements, but I would say the fundamentals we have pretty darn good, And I'm a very, very practical guy in terms of, I have HiFi Klubben. We sell 1.2 million products in a year. We sell to a lot of different people. They have their living room. They cannot, arrange their living room into a recording studio and put in bass traps and all different kinds of crap. It's just not practical. So I always say that we need to make sure that the customer who buys good speakers can get good sound. And it should not be complicated to set up. You shouldn't need any acoustical, absorbers, diffusers, and so on with a good sound system. We had a distributor or dealer one time in the UK. He had arranged 2 rooms for his home theater demos. They were exactly the same size. One was with a Steinway system where he had applied Room Perfect. He had a carpet on the floor and he had nothing on the walls, no acoustical treatment. The other room was identical size and he spent £40,000 on room treatment. And he always took people to the untreated room with the Steinway system and Room Perfect, and to the treated room with some other electronics. And everybody enjoyed the Steinway room more. Everybody. So when customers ask, so how much is this Steinway system? He said, it's practically free. Because if you buy something else, you need £40,000 for. And so,
that's a good demo.
Yeah. And you know what is also interesting? We did Room Perfect close to 20 years ago, and we called it Room Perfect. The correction algorithm has not been changed at all. And how many times have you heard the other guys say, oh, now we have found the new, and now we have the upgrade.
Version 2.0, version 3.0.
1.0, whatever. And then I'd like to remind people, if let's say they spend a lot of money on treating the room, you end up very often with a room where you need to pump 10 times more energy into the room to have the same perceived loudness. And if you do that, you get about 10 times more distortion from the speakers. Nowadays, we see people that say, oh, but we pump the sound out with these speakers and that we absorb with some other speakers and so on. And they put a lot of woofers in the same room. And at the end of the day, it's costly. And they create a whole lot of mess.
Yeah.
So my principle for setting up a room, let's say a home theater, is place the speakers where you get the most amount of energy for your listening position, because that's where you have the best transfer of energy from the speaker to your butt. Forget everything else, more or less. Of course, there's something about positioning and so on. And then whatever you have too much, we take it down with Room Perfect. Then you end up with higher dynamic range, more precision in timing, and a system that is much more affordable. Better performance for the money.
Now, would you say, or would you ever consider having Room Perfect as standalone devices as opposed to including them? Because I know you partner with Macintosh, I believe, and then you have the Lyngdorf. Would you ever do a standalone, just Room Perfect device that plays with others?
We actually make one for Macintosh.
Okay.
We don't have our own. And we get the question very often. But we're like purists in terms of signal purity. So when you think about the fact that we make fully digital amplifiers and we keep everything in the digital domain, we control volume playback by the power supply. So we can keep the high resolution audio throughout the system. And if you make a standalone system, analog in, analog out, you have to do an A to D conversion and a D to A conversion.
Gotcha.
And you never know what level people are going to play into that system. So it's not so much the A to D and D to A that is an issue anymore, because they can be fantastically good. But we don't know what level everything is done in. So they might be running at a much lower digital level and thereby sacrificing resolution. In a Steinway system or a Lyngdorf system where we do the volume control in the power supply, we run full digital resolution. And we can run, let's say, a CD resolution at a level where you can't hear the music anymore.
Interesting.
So yeah, but we should make a separate unit, and we'll do it sooner or later, because it's also something that recording studios and so on have been asking for. I want to make one more point about what everybody else is doing in room correction. I always giggle a little bit when I see what they're doing, because they make it look really, really nice from 300, 400, 500 hertz and up, very almost like a straight line with all small little wrinkles on it. Just think about what the output of the amplifier is looking like to compensate in the mid-high frequencies for all these tiny little wrinkles. Does that look nice? No, it looks like a faulty amplifier.
The amplifier is working hard to get that.
Well, the what you input to the speaker is so messed up. So the direct sound is going to be messed up to arrive at a good microphone response in a single size, one single point in the room. Doesn't make sense.
Okay, so I think we have to wrap it up, because I want to respect your time and all of that. I could just keep on going on and on forever, because there's a lot of really interesting stuff here. The last kind of question that I'll ask, and then I'm going to ask my famous closing question, is where we are now. How much of the total audio hi-fi experience do you think that companies actually know? And do you think that there's going to be technologies over the next decade or 2 decades? Is there room for improvement in where we are now?
I think in the practical delivery of good sound at home with people in a normal room, there's still a lot of things we can do even better.
Okay.
But you can always set up a pair of extremely expensive speakers in a dedicated room with all, blah, 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 blah. But, when I go to hi-fi shows, I listen to some of these very, very expensive systems. And I think what is interesting there is they always play exceedingly simple music. A single female voice and some impressive deep bass and so on. They rarely play some fast music, intricate bass notes and so on. And they almost never ever play a closed microphone piano. So I say to people, when you listen to a new hi-fi system, ask to listen to a Steinway grand piano, close mic'd, at a reasonable, realistic level. And you will realize that quite a few systems just don't have the fundamental correct sense of music. And when people say high definition audio with 96 kilohertz and so on, 24 bits and so on, I said, fine, let's do it. Yes, absolutely. Digital is free now. But they often think of high definition as something with a tiny, tiny little detail at the very, very high frequencies that has to be correct. And they completely forget that a grand piano should sound like a grand piano.
Again, going back to the idea of technically perfect versus real world enjoyable.
Yes.
Well, that actually segues into this kind of closing question. So maybe not at a hi-fi show, but if there was a song or an artist or an album that kind of gave the soundtrack to your life, or that you really resonate with, you can always go back and listen to. Do you have one that you could pick out?
Well, I've always been in love with Dire Straits, Mark Knopfler's.
That's some good stuff.
Because he was, I've had the luck to meet him a few times. I was invited over to his studio and so on. And he's very, very interested in good sound. And so we had a few conversations about that. And so I always enjoyed his recordings. Even the recently released from the 80s of the live recordings from that time are fantastic. He had a good band, and he's so meticulous about the way he records his guitar. It's unbelievable. I've never seen anything like it.
That's great. Yeah, I already have a few Dire Straits songs on my playlist, but I think I'm going to go explore some more and give them a new listen.
Well, you should listen for the text also, because he's a fabulous text writer.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
Peter, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate you taking the time. All the best.
Okay, same to you, Jorden.